All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're going to have to ask for your patience for a few more minutes. Our next speaker, Ulrich Obrist, is going to be very exciting, but be just a little bit late. He's in the building, and he is coming up as fast as he can, but please be a little patient. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for waiting for my keynote this afternoon, everyone. It's amazing what has happened in the last 24 hours. I mean, the first day of the convention felt like there was just so much going on, but yet we're just barely halfway through it. What do you think? What was your highlight from yesterday?
I thought it was a great first day. I saw a lot of great sessions. Certainly for me, the highlight was probably seeing Tim Lebrecht speak. He did a great presentation about advantaged humans in the age of robots. Really learned a lot and really inspired by that. How about yourself, Rashik? What was your highlight?
My highlight yesterday was the keynote with Sheryl Sandberg and Dr. Zetche. One thing I got out of that is I do need to go home and start doing my laundry now. I do. I already told my wife last night, and she's like, finally, you said something right. Okay. So,
who knew laundry was the aphrodisiac that we all needed?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Speaking of highlights, big highlight tomorrow. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the closing keynote tomorrow, if you haven't heard already, is the artist A$AP Rocky. You should be here tomorrow afternoon. It's going to be right here at 3:30, so don't miss it. It's one hell of a way to close out this entire convention.
All right, and really looking forward to today's keynote. To tell us more about that is Leah Steinacre, who is the Chief Innovation Officer from Germany's leading business magazine. Here we go.
Hugh and Rashik. So I'm here, as usual, to remind you, first of all, to use Slido, please. If you have questions for our upcoming speaker, it's going to be very interactive that way. We will have first a bit of a presentation, then a conversation, and then we'd love to include your questions as well. So go to the MeConvention app, to the menu, ask and vote, choose the stage, and ask your questions. We have a very exciting speaker coming up. He is an art curator, an historian, an academic lecturer, but most importantly, he is the artistic director of the Serpentine Galleries in London. And he will be talking about the cultural phenomenon of curation, and ranging across industries from philosophy, ecology, architecture, technology. He'll sort of look at how in the modern day world one can curate, and whether social media creators, for example, could also be curators. But to introduce him properly, please welcome to the stage, first of all, before we'll listen to Ulrich Obrist, Bettina Korek, the founder and CEO of For Your Art.
Bettina Korek. I'm the founder of For Your Art. Ulrich Obrist's mind can be compared to a computer, a social network, or an archive, to any hive-like symbol of the infinite connections available to us today. As the information age's preeminent exhibition maker, he has redefined his profession. Rem Koolhaas has said that his exhibitions present a heroic effort to preserve the traces of intelligence of the last 50 years, to make sense of the seemingly disjointed, a hedge against the systematic forgetting that is hidden at the core of the information age. His groundbreaking, cross-disciplinary, collaborative effort to curating has led him on a literally non-stop global journey, from contemporary art into an expanded field of disciplines including architecture, literature, philosophy, and science. As was said, he's the artistic director of the Serpentine Galleries. He's curated more than 300 exhibitions. He was an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects, a Folkwang Prize winner, and a global leader of Tomorrow for Davos. His Art of Handwriting project, you can find on all of your tote bags, is on his Instagram. I hope that you'll all follow him at Ulrich Obrist. And it's meant to cast a light on the disappearance of handwriting. Please join me in welcoming Ulrich. It's also his birthday today.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you very much. And many thanks to Bettina Korek. I'm going to talk today about curating. As Bettina said, I'm going to talk about a wider sense of curating of art, but also curating of other disciplines. And I'm going to start with the very beginning. I wanted to begin with the very first exhibition I've organized as a student in 1991, with a very sort of DIY spirit. The exhibition had a budget of 200 euros, and it happened in my kitchen of my student apartment. The artist Hans-Peter Fellmann didn't want to use the kitchen, so he did a fridge exhibition. So you had to open the fridge to see his work with marble eggs and feathers. And the artist Fischli Weiss created a kitchen altar. The exhibition lasted 3 months and was visited by 27 people, and subsequently became a rumor. Here you have Richard Wentworth. He gave the show the title. It was called World Soup. And soon after, I curated my first museum show, which happened in 1992, 1993 in the Nietzsche House in Sils Maria. For those of you who have never been to Sils Maria, it's a very magical place. It's the place where I always go to write. It's the place where I think. It's on almost 2,000 meters altitude. It's where the light of the north meets the light of the south in the Swiss mountains, in the Engadin. It's where Nietzsche wrote Zarathustra, and where there is this tiny little museum in Nietzsche's house. I knew at the time that the great artist Gerhard Richter would spend a lot of time in the Engadin, as many artists in generations before him would do. Artists and writers and philosophers are all inspired by these amazing landscapes, by the light, by the energy of the Engadin. So I decided to invite him to do this exhibition in the Nietzsche House. One pattern which was here already at stake, which continued ever since, is that I've always believed in this idea of lifelong learning and mentorship, and I've always, no matter where I am, in different cities where I work, I've always, looked for mentors from whom I can learn. And Gerhard Richter was one of my first great mentors. I learned from the great artists how to do an exhibition, how to do a book, how to install an exhibition. And we showed for the first time. And that, of course, is a very important aspect of exhibitions, to show things which have never been shown before. We showed for the first time his overpainted photographs, these amazing works where he combines painting and photography. So it was a series of overpainted photographs of the Swiss mountains. Here you see the whole series. So that was the kind of first museum show, I could say. And in a way, a second influence soon after, when I moved to London, John Latham became a mentor. A very interesting piece actually on him today in the New York Times. He is an artist who decided, or basically that for him, art should go into society. And that for me was a great inspiration. I was kind of very inspired by his ideas of time, introducing time in his art. But his idea actually of him having founded what he called, with Barbara Stevini, the Artist Placement Group. He was convinced that art should be carried into society. So he founded an organization which would give the artist a place. He felt that every major company, every major brand, every major administration, every ministry should have an artist in residence, an artist who would regularly visit, would challenge the premises. He himself, to give you an example, placed himself in the Scottish government office, and he actually created these amazing land art pieces, which were just created by him avoiding that these things were removed. So in a way, he really changed, the landscapes and had a very major impact. You can see a more recent, impact of that artist placement group idea actually when the city of Manchester appointed Peter Saville a few years ago to be the great designer, Peter Saville, and artist, to be their creative director. And all of a sudden, Manchester was reinvented. A new festival was born with Alex Poots. and the city had a new energy. So it's a great recommendation to all of you, if you have a company or a major brand, is to have an artist in residence, as John Latham and Barbara Stevini advised, and amazing things will happen. Of course, this idea of art and society has also to do with Joseph Beuys. Growing up in Switzerland, I attended a lecture by him where actually Joseph Beuys talked about him co-founding the Green Party in Germany, and I was very inspired by this idea of an expanded notion of art, how art can expand. And I was thinking, as a curator, what would that mean for curating? It might actually mean to go beyond the mere exhibition of objects, because of course, what is a curator? It comes from the Latin word curare. It's taking care of collections, of objects, in museums, and that is still a very important part of what, I do, of what the curator does. It's making junctions between objects. It's a form of junction making. But if we follow the idea of an expanded notion of art, it means much more than that. It means, not only making junctions between art objects, it means also making junctions between maybe quasi-object, to quote Michel Serres. Quasi-objects are objects which only gain a meaning when we interact with them. Or Timothy Martin talks about hyper-objects, bigger systems, the climate, the weather. So we could think about such systems, in terms of curating. And in a way, all of that was really triggered by this lecture I attended of Joseph Beuys. I more recently was interested, to find recent examples of artists who actually want to kind of contribute to society and enter society. And a particularly interesting example is Tania Bruguera. She founded Arte Utile, which literally means useful art, and has developed a long-term project that include a community center, a political party for immigrants, and also an institution working towards civic literacy. To quote her, is a quote of Tania Bruguera: "I keep encountering limitations while doing my work, but in the process, I found a great group of artists that had already been dealing with the same issues for a long time. I could identify them with what I called arte utile, useful art, because they went beyond complaining about social problems and instead tried to change them by implementing different solutions. They were not only imagining impossible utopian situations, but they were also trying to build practical utopias." So kind of concrete utopias. So when I prepared a talk at Creative Time about this topic of artists, going into politics, artists making social sculpture, Tania Bruguera, very surprisingly, on the occasion of the conference, and you can see this clip online, announced that she would run for president of Cuba against Raúl Castro in 2018. And of course, we have another example for that in Albania, where the great artist Edi Rama, Edi Rama is a painter and a wonderful artist who decided to actually carry his art into politics, into infrastructure, and he has just been re-elected a few weeks ago for the second time, the Prime Minister of Albania. So that would be another example, of such a social sculpture. Here you have the examples of Edi Rama. He was first actually the mayor of Tirana before he became Prime Minister. And as the mayor, he decided that it was very little money to make a difference. There were very, very small budgets. So he decided that the biggest impact to kind of create a positive spirit could be if he would actually paint, if he would paint the buildings, if he would sort of introduce color into this very, very gray, rather depressed city. So he started himself at night, after work as a mayor, to go back to his practice as a painter and develop these schemes to paint entire parts of Tirana, and subsequently also invited artists to, to contribute to this big social sculpture. Or we have, for example, the Astor Gates project, in Chicago. The Stony Island Arts Bank, should you ever be in Chicago, it's very urgent to visit. It's another example where an artist creates very concrete utopias, creates very concrete infrastructure. Or here, Tania Bruguera, who also, besides her running for president, also founded, her own movement, and that's here the logo. Another mentor is Edouard Glissant, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about him. For me, he is the ultimate toolbox for the 21st century. He is, for me, a writer we should all read, we can all learn from, because we live, of course, in an age of globalization. My work as a curator, the art field, but also, I suppose, all of your work is, of course, deeply affected by. It's not the first time the world experiences globalization, but it is certainly one of the most extreme forms of globalization. And Clisson very early wrote about this. You see here an exhibition we did in a tribute to him. And he actually found different notions, which I think are very relevant for now. He came from Martinique, so the Antillean archipelago is his home. And of course, this archipelago, which you see here, which he drew, was very, very important for his thinking. It's an island group which has no center, but consists of a string of many different islands and cultures. The exchange that takes place between these islands allows each to preserve its own identity. I'm going to quote Clisson now. The American archipelagos are extremely important because it was in these islands that the idea of creolization, that means the blend of cultures, was most brilliantly fulfilled. Continents reject mixings, whereas archipelagic thought makes it possible to say that neither each person's identity nor the collective identity are fixed and established once and for all. I can change through exchange with the other without losing or diluting my sense of self. And it is archipelagic thought that teaches us this. Now, this is very important in the current situation where, on the one hand, we can see homogenizing forces of globalization at stake, and they lead to make us lose a lot of things. I'm going to talk about that later, what are we winning and what are we losing. But yet, at the same time, we have in the world a counter-reaction against globalization, which is absolutely devastating, which leads to new forms of lack of tolerance and to new forms of oppression. So Clisson says we need neither nor. We need to resist a homogenizing globalization, but we also need to resist this counter-reaction at the moment against global dialogue. And he coined this notion of mondialité, which is globality. And he thinks archipelagic thought is the solution. It endeavors to do justice to the world's diversity. It's a celebration of diversity. It forms an antithesis to continental thought, because, of course, continental thought is, very homogenizing. It has an absoluteness, and it tries to force its worldview on other countries. So basically, to counter this homogenizing force of globalization, he says mondialité, and maybe in English we could call mondialité globality, is a form of worldwide exchange that recognizes and preserves diversity and creolization. So for me and all my exhibitions, this has always been a toolbox. I have a lot of rituals. I believe that we need to reintroduce new rituals. So whenever I wake up in the morning, I read 50 minutes of Edouard Glissant, to be sure that whatever I do is a contribution, to what he calls mondialité. To give you one concrete example for how we apply this, because it's not an abstract theory, it's a very concretely applied theory. Do It is an exhibition which has been one of the most traveled exhibitions of probably ever. It has been in 165 cities so far, all over the world. We started it in 1993 with Christian Boltanski and Bertrand Lavier, and the idea is to do an exhibition with instructions, with how-to manuals, where basically the artwork can be interpreted locally, differently each time. So here you have an exhibition which is basically sent around the world, but it's not always the same. It changes wherever it goes. It learns from the local context, and it's an ever-growing archive. So here, for example, the legendary Felix González Torres, he gives the instruction to throw a certain quantity of locally wrapped candies into a corner, and the visitors are then allowed to take them away. And of course, each time it creates a very different sculpture wherever it takes place. And that leads us to the next inspiration. I wanted to talk about Gustav Metzger. Gustav Metzger passed away in 2017, a German artist, German-English artist. He was based in London. As a war refugee during the Second World War, came with a children transport to the UK, and has developed an amazing work where he actually talks about extinction. His whole work is about extinction because he says if we talk about climate change, no one will ever wake up. So we need to talk about, like, I mean, Elizabeth Kolbert does it in her book, no? When she writes about the sixth extinction in which we are now in the middle of it. So Gustav developed a notion of extinction. He said we need to remember nature, and he wanted his work to be a wake-up call for all of us together. And that, in a way, leads us, of course, to the fact what we might lose. And extinction is not only the extinction of species. There is, of course, a mass extinction of species happening on this planet, but there is also an extinction of a lot of different cultural phenomena. Languages, for example, every day we are losing languages. Susan Hiller made a wonderful movie where she documents, the languages the world is losing, and of course also war. As Etel Adnan, who is another great inspiration. For those of you who haven't read Etel Adnan, she is the most urgent poet and writer of the 21st century. She has written the ultimate book about the war in Lebanon, a book which is still very relevant now, many, many decades after. And she talks about the war and many wars in the world happening right now as one of the worst forms of extinction. Etel Adnan is also a visual artist and a painter. She really develops a kind of a Gesamtkunstwerk and was part of our Serpentine Gallery Extinction Marathon. So with Gustav Metzger, we gathered 100 practitioners from all disciplines and basically asked them to talk about what might be lost and what we need to preserve, what we need to not lose. Here you have the stage set, which was designed by Heather Phillipson. And of course, this leads us to a project I wanted to emphasize here, particularly today, which is, because as Bettina mentioned, you all have these bags with the handwritten sentences, and I'm going to give you now the explanation of the project. So out of this whole research about extinction, I started to realize in many conversations that maybe handwriting could disappear. Handwriting could disappear. It came to my attention when actually the son of a friend of mine who is like 18 years old was writing a note, and I suddenly realized that it was the handwriting, of somebody who wasn't 18 years old, of somebody who was maybe 5 or 6 years old. So I suddenly thought, like, wow, maybe in the digital age, handwriting might disappear. And that, of course, has a lot to do with the early resistance also Steve Jobs had against stylos, because he always wanted, the iPhone and all smartphones to be kind of one object. So there wasn't, now stylos with the tablets are coming back more, and that gives us the possibility of reintroducing doodling, and handwriting in the digital age. But I felt it is important to just celebrate handwriting. And in a way, I realized I meet artists every day as a curator. I meet architects every day. I meet designers every day, scientists, novelists, poets. So it would be very easy to ask them to handwrite a sentence and then post it on Instagram. And in a way, I never knew what to post on Instagram. I was basically, 2 friends of mine, Kevin McGarry and Ryan Tricartin, downloaded the app on my phone, and they told all their thousands of followers that I had joined Instagram, but I needed to come up with an idea. I knew that I didn't, want to post selfies. I also knew that I didn't kind of want to post, my food. I also thought, it would be inappropriate, to post studio visits, because studios of artists, are a private space, and I think it wouldn't be right to post that. So I kind of was searching for something which would be urgent. That's the other thing. I'm always wondering, what is urgent? So then I suddenly found that idea of handwriting, and it actually occurred to me, interestingly enough, on a walk with Etel Adnan. So the great poet and artist and writer and I were on a walk in Bretagne, in Brittany, in France, and it started to rain, and so we needed to find shelter. We went to a cafe, and I was on my smartphone, we had, of course, a conversation, but then after an hour and a half, I started to be on my smartphone, and she started to write this beautiful poem on a piece of paper. So I took a photo, and I posted it on Instagram, and I suddenly thought it could be very, very exciting, to develop a movement of handwritten sentences. So here you see a few of these sentences. Some are very political, some are poetic, some address very directly the viewer, the reader. Some some are basically related to exhibitions I curate. Some are related to interviews I do. So Arthur Jeffer, for example, is the artist we've just exhibited at the Serpentine. Jane Goodall, of course, the great author. We did a project with her and Rosemary Trockel when she wrote this sentence. Rike Tiravanish, who is an artist who works a lot with text. So text is actually part of the work. And so it's become a ritual to every day, post these sentences on Instagram. At a certain moment, Mike Krieger, the co-founder of Instagram, and I had a conversation, and he said, it might be actually nice to film the act of writing. So we started to post the little films, of the actual act of writing, and also the environment in which it happens. Very often, some artworks are also posted to give an idea of what the artists do. Here you have the composer and artist Brian Eno. Again, Etel Adnan. Sometimes it's a real small manifesto. I think this little text is kind of almost like a manifesto of what the world needs right now. Togetherness, not separation. Love, not suspicion. A common future, not isolation. The poet Eileen Myers said, "Make America Mexico again." And then, of course, I have some artists are almost like in residence in my Instagram project because I see them regularly, and they're not using themselves Instagram a lot, so my Instagram becomes their Instagram. So he's only recently joined Instagram, Douglas Copeland, the great writer, but for a couple of years, he posted all his posts on my Instagram. So it's almost like residences, within my Instagram, a kind of a Russian Matrushka. And of course, at the end, we're going to do a book. I kind of love the idea also that Instagram is a vehicle to maybe, to produce a book. And then at a certain moment, it started to become a little bit boring. Because, I felt almost like I had made my own prison because I couldn't post anything else but these handwritten sentences on Instagram. And the more I did it, the more it became difficult to post something else. And then I visited a very old surrealist poet, Valaoritis in Greece. And he was a friend of André Breton and the Surrealists. And he basically told me that the Surrealists had this game, which many of you, I'm sure, know from childhood, called the exquisite corpse, where you fold a piece of paper in 3 or 4 parts, and then someone does the head, next part, and until you unfold it and then have the whole body. So we started to do that, initially just with 2, when I met here, for example, the artist Alex Israel and the writer Bret Easton Ellis. We still have the sentences parallel to that. Some artists started to go from the sentences more to sketching, to doodling, to drawing. So the project became more diverse, over time. So now we have the exquisite corpse. That's almost like a project within the project. We have the drawings, and we have and that's actually very interesting because that is a participatory project by Olafur Eliasson. And he thinks that we should at least once a day smile every day. And it was actually interesting because parallel, it's of course like lots of different rituals. Another ritual is whenever I arrive in a city, I ask my friends in the city, is there a pioneer? Who is the Louis Bourgeois? Is there a visionary, very old person of wisdom whom I can go and interview, from whom I can learn? So I've done this in all the cities in the world, and as part of that, in a way, grew a big archive of conversations, of interviews from which I learned. And I visited, as part of that, an extraordinary 106-year-old writer called Alice Herz-Sommer. And when I asked her about the secret, why she was in such great shape, going swimming every day, she said smile. Smiling is very important. So Olafur Eliasson made this piece where he wants to actually smile. So I wanted to encourage you all to smile for Olafur. I think it's urgent. It's urgent to smile. Here we have more of Rikrit. He is also in residence. Vitalik Buterin is the founder of Ethereum. We're going to talk about that later. Quoting a Yudkowsky quote about algorithms. Gilbert and George talk about the moral dimension of our living as art, as a definition of art. The artist Grayson Perry calls for luxury brands for social justice. And here is a small conundrum of Peter Saville, you know, the artist I mentioned at the beginning, who transformed Manchester single-handedly. He invites you to choose two. James Bridle. Ian Cheng thinks that email is a defunct medium. We should invent something else. And of course, Dayanita Singh invites us, you know, to build your own museum. And that's, you know, what I started with, the DIY thing with the kitchen show. We can all do our own museum in a DIY way. We have also lots of different, you know, people, artists inventing their own way of writing, their own handwriting. Here, Genesis Breyer P. Origis. We have Agitprop with Paul Chan. And the promise of John Baldessari that he will not make any more boring art. David Hockney, it's kind of interesting that he, as an artist, you know, who is very senior, was actually one of the first artists to participate in my project, not with a handwritten doodle, but doing it with a stylo on his iPad. And here Daniel Boyd sing about silence. Henry Sala's Memory of George Orwell. And last but not least, Zaha Hadid, the great architect, the late Zaha Hadid. That's my motto every day. There should be no end to experimentation. And that leads us to exhibitions, exhibitions as endless experiments, inventing new rules of the game. I'm going to show you a few exhibitions. I mean, of course, already with Do It and the handwriting project, you know, we're in the middle of that. We invent, you know, it's a rule of the game. We came to the conclusion with Klaus Biesenbach a few years ago that actually many artists were interested in live art. It has to do, I suppose, with the digital age. In a similar way as live concerts are relevant again, artists want to, you know, to show live art in exhibitions. So we decided to do an exhibition where you would have rooms, and in every room the viewer would encounter a living sculpture. The only difference to the sculpture is that, you know, it's open from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. and then at 6 p.m. the sculptures go home and they come back the next morning. Here, Roman Ondak, his sculpture was an exchange. People could swap objects. Simon Fujiwara, somebody welcomed you in their bed. Tino Segal, who of course has pioneered for many years this idea of, you know, of live art, of living sculptures. The same is true for Xu Zhen, Joan Jonas, who has pioneered it since the 70s, and of course also Bruce Nauman. So in every room, Zhang Wan, you had a living sculpture all day long. So it became almost like a museum, no? A different type of museum. You were also with these works on your own. So it was an intimate experience because you opened the door and closed the door behind you. Here, Otobong Nakanga with a choreography in her room. Or Dominique Gonzalez-Förster, where the rule was that only one person could enter. We pushed that further when with Philippe Barreno we did an opera where we gave every artist time and not space. You can see this opera online. It's a whole evening filling program. Philippe used a ventriloquist. Tino Segal made the curtains dance following the soundtrack of Daft Punk. And here I'm going to show you what happened with the piece of Olafur Eliasson, because it took a long time for the audience to find out what's going on, because initially they just saw themselves mirrored in a big mirror. But then So it took the audience a little while to find out that actually the orchestra would replicate all the noise which came. So if somebody would cough, the orchestra would cough. And once people realized, everybody started to make noise, and it became a very, dense environment. Pierre Week's Monsters popped up. You had another time-based work by Ricky Gervais and Arthur Lindsay. Couchongas tree added the smell of a forest into the audience. Dominique Gonzalez-Förster's piece ended the opera, so one musician after the other, left until it turned silence. Fischli Weiss's appearance of the rat and the bear. Anyway, the whole thing is 90 minutes, and for those of you who want to know more, you can see the whole opera online. And that, of course, of a time-based exhibition leads us also to the Serpentine Gallery's marathon. It was actually in 2005 that I came up with the idea of the marathon as a format where we would invite people from all kinds of disciplines to explore one topic over 24 hours. The idea would be that we realized that when we do a talk by an architect, the architecture world will come. When we do a talk by a scientist, the science world will come. So we tried to come up with a format where these would actually mix, and you would have people from different fields, meet each other, believing that we can only address the big problems of the 21st century if all the different, disciplines collaborate. So we initially started with the interview marathon, how to do a portrait of a city. We did a London marathon in 2006 with Rem Koolhaas. Then we invited artists to do experiments in 2007. In 2008, we invited artists, scientists, equally architects to present manifestos. Are there still manifestos for our time? For example, the Ecological Manifesto of Vivienne Westwood. In 2010, we addressed the topic of mapping. What are maps? Analog maps, digital maps. In 2015, we addressed the topic of transformation with Etel, Obinyavanga Wainaina, and many different practitioners. It each year creates a whole, polyphony of talks which are on the Serpentine website, but which, of course, create a lot of junctions between people who afterwards continue to collaborate and exchange. And it always happens in conjunction with our pavilion. And I'm going to talk more now about the pavilion. The Serpentine Pavilion was initiated by our former director, Julia Peyton-Johns, with Zaha Hadid, who very sadly passed away last year. So I would like to dedicate this talk to her memory. Zaha's first pavilion in front of the Serpentine. So the idea is, how can an art institution be fresh and new? How can it be blue ocean every year? And the idea is to just by adding a new institution every summer. So we're building on the lawn in front of the Serpentine a new structure every summer. For example, here you have the one by Oskar Niemeyer. And I joined in 2006, so the first one I co-commissioned was Rem Koolhaas with the engineer Cecil Balmont. On a sunny day, this pavilion could actually fly out of the park like a balloon, and then at the end of the day, we'd pull it back. Zaha Hadid, her second pavilion in 2007. The artist Olafur Eliasson with Cecil Balmont in 2008. Frank Gehry, 2008. 2009, Sana, the Japanese office of Katsuo Sejima and Ryue Nishizawa. It is always the first structure an architect builds in the UK. And one of the things I think which is very important is that it basically also carries our institution. It carries the Serpentine to the people. It carries it into the park. So a couple of months ago, A taxi driver dropped me. I came back from a trip very early, like at 7 a.m., and the driver dropped me in Kensington Gardens. And he obviously assumed that because I would go there so early, I would somehow work there because it was out of opening hours. So he said he has to tell me a story. He has to tell me the story of his daughter. So he came last summer to the Serpentine Pavilion, and he didn't ever intend to come to the pavilion. He just went on a walk in the park, and he said all of a sudden his daughter ran into the pavilion, and he had to go and fetch her. She was a 14-year-old kid, and basically they couldn't continue the walk because she was totally mesmerized by the pavilion, and he had a really hard time to get her out. And he said he would never ever go to a museum. So this was all very strange for him. So I said, why he would not go to a museum? Because we have free admission. And that's anyway, the minimum that one has free admission, because in a time of increased inequality, it seems very important for me that everybody, has access to art. But free admission is not enough. He said he still wouldn't go because he thinks it would not be for people like him, right? So there is a strange barrier still there. And obviously because our pavilion, goes into the park, all of a sudden this barrier is no longer there. And this kid could just run into the pavilion, have an experience. And the real reason why he wanted to tell me the story was actually to thank us, because he says that his daughter ever since talks about nothing else but architecture. He's reading architecture books around the clock, and that he is 100% convinced, that she will become an architect. So in a way, this idea that we carry the museum spaces, that we carry art into the world, that we carry architecture into the world, is very, very important with this scheme. Here you have Jean Nouvel. And of course, it's completely up to the user how they use this pavilion. So we are not, curatorially prescriptive, where we say, here is a cafe. Here, for example, in Jean Nouvel's pavilion, people love to play chess and ping pong and all kinds of games. They brought their own, equipment there. It became a game parlor. And then the year after, with Peter Zumthor, it was quite the opposite. It was a very peaceful, also quiet. It was almost like a cloister. He built this pavilion around the garden of Piet Oudolf, and people came just here to have a break from the noise of the city, to sit there, have an exchange. It's also very important that people are not obliged to consume. It's a free zone in the city where people can just come and spend time, and also check their email or have a meeting with friends, have gatherings. The year after, we had IVV and Herzog de Meuron, and they basically made an archaeology of all our previous pavilions and sank the pavilion with cork into the ground. So as you can see here, the pavilion became almost like a pool. It became almost invisible. So obviously, the architects react to whoever did the pavilion beforehand. And then in 2013, we decided to work with a younger generation of architects. Su Fujimoto did this floating pavilion, which became almost like a mini city at night. Then a much more archaic and in a way also Stonehenge-like pavilion by Smiljan Radic, who designed the 2014 pavilion. Was also like a spaceship which has landed in the park. And then Sel Gascano, the pavilion in 2015, the young Spanish office. That's a collaboration with Second Home. Here the pavilion at night. 2016, the architect Bjarke Ingels, like a gigantic zip. At the same time, it's also like a climbing wall, again for people, to find many different ways of using the pavilion. And this year's pavilion has just been prolongated. We decided this week that it's up until later in November. So you have another 2 months, if you're in London, to come and see this. It's the pavilion by Francis Queret, a Berlin-based architect from Burkina Faso, who has developed this amazing structure, which actually funnels the rain on a rainy day and creates an amazing cascade in the middle. At the same time, on a sunny day, it's a meeting point. It's also a shelter at all weather. You can see it here. So in a way, you can say that the pavilion is almost like an additional wing, no? Because usually when you have a museum, you very seldomly build a new building, maybe every 10 or 20 years, or you have a renovation. But we build a new building, once a year. It's there for 3 months, and then it goes to another city. For example, the Su Fujimoto Pavilion, I showed you earlier, the Japanese pavilion, is at the moment in Tirana with the artist Prime Minister Edi Rama for 3 years in collaboration with the Luma Foundation. So many of these pavilions, become public after London in another place and are being used, etc., etc. Talking about a wing we believe that now the time has come. We have our exhibitions, we have our architecture as a second wing. It's now time for the digital wing, so as to say. We decided to actually, Jana Pihl and I, our CEO and I, decided to appoint with Ben Vickers, a Chief Technology Officer, and we make digital art a very big main focus of our organization. And I'm going to show you here a short clip of Ian Cheng, an app which you can also download from the Serpentine website. So the corgi never does what you want. It's a kind of a disobedient corgi, but you'll find out playing with the corgi what exactly is going to happen. Ian Cheng is working on a AR and VR commission, which we're going to open in March, and this whole aspect of our program is going to become much more important. That's the future. I want to talk about the present, the exhibitions of this summer at the Serpentine Gallery, to give you an idea of the whole campus, of all the different layers of our activity. You have the pavilion, you have the digital commission, and you have exhibitions in our two buildings, in the Serpentine and the Serpentine Sackler. Grayson Perry did an exhibition with a self-fulfilling prophetic title. He called it the most popular art exhibition ever, and it actually did become our most popular art exhibition ever, with more than 200,000 visitors. Grayson Perry says, I'm in the communication business, and I want to communicate to as wide an audience as possible. Nothing pleases me more than meeting someone at one of my exhibitions from what museum people call a non-traditional background. The new works I'm making all have ideas about popularity hovering around them. What kind of art do people like? What subjects? Why do people like going to art galleries these days? So Grayson made many, many conversations, interviews. He analyzed the Brexit, for example, found out that actually people who are for and against the Brexit both love David Bowie. But he also found out that people who are for the Brexit are very bad photographers in social media, but actually people who are against the Brexit are much better photographers. These are just two examples. There are, thousands of them, which he kind of weaved into the exhibition, which was our summer show at the Serpentine Sackler. We had the exhibition of Arthur Jafa, which is now also going to go on a tour. It's the first UK exhibition of this visionary artist who invited artists Ming Smith, Frida Urupapu, and Miscellaneous to do this show with him. Across 3 decades, Jaffa has developed a dynamic multidisciplinary practice ranging from films and installations to lecture performances and also happenings. His work is driven by a very recurrent question: how might one identify and develop a specifically black visual aesthetics equal to the power, to the beauty, and the alienation of black music in US culture? So you see here some images of the show. The title of the exhibition relates to the sense of absence that Jaffa observes as haunting black life. The word rendition in the title refers to the artist's interpretation of the aesthetics associated with black being, which are historically inscribed in images, in objects, and in artifacts. By reperforming these narratives in the present, Jaffa imagines and constructs new possibilities for making them visible. So the exhibition also included his amazing archive, and you saw how his practice actually shifted, from analog filmmaking into digital filmmaking in the process. And that, of course, brings us to the digital generation of artists. A couple of years ago, I started a project with Simon Caste, where we started to map what we call the 89+ generation, because we realized actually that the millennial generation had access to the World Wide Web, to internet, usually in their early or mid-teens, but that the new generation of artists was emerging, born in the 1990s, who actually had access to the internet, to World Wide Web, from the very early childhood onwards. So we took 1989 as the point of departure. 1989 is, of course, the year when Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. and we started to map the artists born in '89 and younger. We have a database of so far more than 7,000 artists from all over the world. It's of course very democratic because every artist can upload their work, to the site, and we see it. So every morning when I wake up, I see artists from all over the world who submit their work, and out of that we start to detect slowly patterns that connect. Surprisingly, one of the first patterns we found was actually that many of these artists have a connection to poetry. So the sort of whole nexus which you have in Dada and Surrealism in the 20th century is back with a vengeance in the digital age, and you have a whole flourishing new art poetry scene. So we decided to actually publish 1,000 books, which is always the first book by these poets and artists. So it's kind of gives them their publishing debut. It's books printed on demand, and did a first exhibition with the Luma Foundation on poetry. We then worked in Paris on new experiments in art and technology at the Cartier Foundation. And the second exhibition at the Luma Foundation looked at the phenomenon of the filter bubble. The filter bubble is the term coined by Elie Parisot in his 2011 book of the same name, which designates the way internet users are increasingly directed to a personalized information landscape through an algorithmic editing of web content. So we invited 30 artists to explore these notions of the filter bubble. And this leads us to the 2017 exhibition, which is a kind of a third pattern we detected, where we wanted to address algorithmic citizenship. We wanted to look in how art practice, how artists from all over the world deal with algorithmic citizenship. Because Worldwide Web inventor Tim Berners-Lee explains that he originally imagined the web as an open platform that would allow everyone to share information, access opportunities, and to collaborate across geographic and also cultural boundaries. So basically positing an international perspective, this exhibition here, American 17, echoes the internet's original universal kind of promise of alternatives to jus soli and jus sanguinis citizenship, all while examining the enduring sway of the United States over the World Wide Web at the time when its government is veering towards discrimination and isolationism. So it really looks at what is 21st century citizenship. And this exhibition happened this summer in Zurich, and will now go also on a tour. So you can see all of these exhibitions kind of as growing archives. Now I'm going to talk, I started with the kitchen exhibition, and I want to kind of end on another sort of very intimate experience, which has to do with time and kind of how editing time differently. Because I was always interested in, and please give a very warm welcome to Bettina Korek. I wanted to talk a little bit about my kind of strange time habits, because when I sort of started to work, I realized that I couldn't do all the things I wanted to do. And I was very inspired by Balzac and his amazing productivity, because he had written so many books. And I realized that he drank 52 coffees every day, to make that happen. So I tried to copy him when I was like 19, 20, and I drank 50 coffees, and it wasn't kind of sustainable. So after a couple of months, I stopped it. I then came across Leonardo da Vinci and his kind of output. And I read that his output was determined by a very strange sleep rhythm, where he would always be 3 hours awake, and then he would sleep for 15 minutes, and then he would again be 3 hours awake. So he would sleep 7, 8 times a day for 15 minutes. And I can really recommend the Da Vinci rhythm, because with about 2 hours, 3 hours sleep, one is never tired. The only problem is that it's kind of socially not compatible, because after 3 hours, you really then have to sleep for 15 minutes. So it created weird problems when I would sort of sleep at the office, and people thought I had collapsed, etc. So that rhythm also wasn't sustainable. It was very good for me to write my first 3 books. but I had to stop it. It was also kind of a drama because when I went on a vacation, I forgot my huge alarm clock, which maintained the Da Vinci rhythm, and my entire building, a high-rise lift on the Da Vinci rhythm, so we were evicted from the apartment. So I was still a student then, so I had to find other, sleeping patterns. And at a certain moment, I found out, found out that what is important, of course, is to sleep, because if you don't sleep, you don't dream. So I then invented a kind of a new rhythm, where I would basically, my night producer, you see here, Max Shackleton, would work, who is also with us here today. Max Shackleton would actually work for me and with me from midnight to 6, 7 a.m. And we would always meet around 11 and then, work for an hour and again in the morning. And so it almost doubles my day. So the notion of a night producer. Then I also realized at a certain moment, around 2000, I started to have a permanent job. I was, curator at the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris, and then in 2006, the Serpentine. So I had, office hours. So I then realized that I just needed to double my week. And we then started to basically do Monday to Thursday, Friday in the office, and then every weekend would be another trip. And then we founded the Brutally Early Club and the OM3 AM, but maybe we can talk about that during the discussion. So thank you all very much for your attention.
So there's some great questions. We only have time for a few, and we're going to start with Sven's. Is the internet the new gallery?
I think in a way it's never going to replace, the experience of an exhibition. If you look, for example, at the exhibitions I showed you today, these exhibitions cannot really shown in images. They are multidimensional experiences. Live art needs to be experienced in the space. If you look at the opera, I just showed you a few images, but that's a 90-minute experience which appeals to all the senses, where you have Liam Gillick and Philippe Pareno taking you on a journey of many artists, and you basically. The same thing is true for the exhibitions at the Serpentine. If you look at the Arthur Schaeffer exhibition, that's an exhibition which has many, many sound dimensions. It's a tactile experience. You touch the images in his books. You navigate through his worlds, for hours and hours. So this is never something which is going to be replaced by digital exhibitions. But it definitely, can be complemented or supplemented. It's kind of like an additional dimension. So for example, for me, Instagram, I absolutely love Instagram, not only because I became very addicted to do it every day, but also just to see what all these different artists do, because many artists do actually exhibitions on Instagram. They show work which otherwise we wouldn't see. So for example, Stephen Shaw does a lot of photos which you can only see on his Instagram account and nowhere else. So it's kind of an additional kind of layer. And of course, we're on the brink now of going from VR to AR. And it's going to be very interesting to see how for the first time when we have augmented reality in exhibitions, we can actually then, combine it. Because so far, when we have VR in a show, you have visitors who see the show, and then all of a sudden they sink into the VR land, and you lose them for the exhibition, and they're in some other zone, and it's kind of very separated. But with AR, we could have this experience that people kind of experience it both ways, and that's definitely going to change things.
I think another nice question that's connected to that is from MC. Have you ever attended an exhibition that was curated by AI, and would you like to?
Yeah, I spoke to Demis Hassabis the other day, and it could definitely be interesting at some point to have an exhibition, curated by a curator, and then have an exhibition curated by a machine, and then have it compared. Yeah, it could be an experiment.
And then let's end with Alex's question. As someone who's never found real access to art, how would you spark my interest?
I think in a way, the most important thing is this idea that if we go back to the taxi driver story, is that for many people, an encounter does not necessarily happen in the museum, because people would not first go to a museum, but it encounters when they meet art outside the museum. So I would say it's all these possibilities we have to see art, in public space. And there are so many possibilities for that. We did a whole museum called Museum in Progress with the late Joseph Artner and Katrin Mesner, where we organized exhibitions on billboards, a bit like you, Bettina, do in LA with For Your Art, where we did public art exhibitions in newspapers, etc., etc. You know, and of course there is also Instagram. The same thing is true if you think about the pavilion experience in the park. So we can encounter art where we expect it least. So I would say, you know, the answer to that question is that we just, you know, need to bring art into many unexpected, you know, environments. I also published this magazine with Agnes B called The Point of Irony, where we print a few 100,000 copies and spread it in different parts of the world, you know, and it's always a printed exhibition. And that again reaches out to people who would never visit, you know, an exhibition. To be open, I suppose.
There's one final question from Caro. Do you curate your own belongings, like objects in a museum? What is a curated life for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because I suppose that in a way I've never really lived in cities where I would have space, you know, so I would in this sense always live in small apartments, so they would be absolutely, you know, jam-packed by books. So I suppose, you know, I live mostly with books, and I think that's also a form of, you know, a form of curating. It's, you know, how we kind of reorder books and reassemble books, etc. And I think it's interesting how in the digital age, the books have actually not become less important. You know, it's not only the poets, but it's also the artists who do. There's an amazing activity with artist books going on right now, and I think it's a great medium. It's a medium which not enough attention is given. So I would say, you know, curating of book in its immediate kind of surrounding.
Thank you, Hans Ulrich, and let's join Anonymous in wishing you a happy birthday.
Thank you, Bettina.